black gold. And when you think about the fact that this soil probably took hundreds of years to form,
Hello, my name is Christine Brown. I'm a field crop sustainability specialist.
well, good day. On behalf of OMAFA, Christine Brown, and myself, Andrew Barry, we'd like to welcome you to the 2025 March Manure Mondays. Last week, we had a very interesting session talking about in-crop application using a technology called 360 rain. Very interesting session. That recording should be posted later today, and it can join the other two from weeks 1 and 2. We will send out an email that will give you the link to those recordings. Okay, today, looking forward to you joining us. Again, please stay muted but active in the chat. And today we are going to be talking about compaction, manure, and technology, the Ontario experience. And I'm thrilled to have my colleague here beside me, Dr. Ian McDonald. Ian and I have worked together many years. In fact, Ian, I remember back to 2013, the very first time we hosted in Ontario, the North American Manure Expo. It was at the Arcal Research Station. And I think that is the first time I saw a little bit of compaction work going on. I remember a plywood board with the tire imprint on it, bit of a what they call a lasagna pit that is highlighting some of the impression from a tire. So I remember that compaction work started back then in 2013. And then 2021, we were able to host the Manure Expo again. Unfortunately, we had to move the event to virtual, but we still did the compaction work live in the field at Listowel, Ontario. And we had a couple of sessions, and Ian and his team were there working with us. And so that was pretty neat. But anyhow, Ian, your presentation is now up. So let me turn it over to you.
We're going to talk about compaction and mostly manure in terms of the theory and then the practice from the work that we've been doing here in Ontario. So in all the work that we've done, it kind of comes down to three things. And I'll add a fourth thing for manure once we get into the presentation. But essentially, the goals are, and some of you will be frustrated with me, and I guess that's okay, but I'm just sort of sharing the facts. So lower the weight, lower the water, and lower the air. And we're going to get to all of that. But essentially, if you remember those three things, that's sort of the goal in terms of avoiding soil compaction. So we'll come back to these, but keep those in mind. So I really want to point out that decision-making on farms is important. We all know that, but sometimes revert back to what somebody tells us to do or what dad did or grandpa did or whatever. And I think we have to think beyond that nowadays. And it's because of these two main reasons: the spatial aspect and the temporal aspect of the landscape. And so when you think of our soil fields, they're much more variable in texture and topography than what we see when we look at them, even if we look and it looks like it's a flat field. And then temporally, we have this aspect of temperature and moistures that continually change across the season. This isn't the best graph because it's showing it at a monthly basis. And usually it's incredible how much variation there is with, between days, let alone weeks, months, and within the year. And so these things all combine to make us think more diligently about the decisions we make, especially in light of the tools that are now available to help us with that. So precision agriculture, site-specific management, this type of thing. And the reason is, we've come to recognize how complex the environment of agriculture is. And so when you look at these, what I call my flower petal diagram on the left-hand side, all these different areas that interrelate to each other. And then you've got all the inputs on the right-hand side. And notice each of the sides of the barrel are different lengths, and that changes the relationship between each of those changes. And so we have to be taking all this into account as we make decisions to optimize our productivity and our economic impact of the decisions that we make. And so, it's quite simple in the fact that it's these 5 things that we need to be concerned about, but we need to be concerned about them for every single field, every single operation that we do, and that's a lot. I had one of the USDA guys from Ames, Iowa, say to me one time there was about 3,000 questions that farmers consciously or subconsciously had to address with the growing of each crop, and that's pretty amazing. And so it's important to think about our decisions. And last year, or even last month's or yesterday's decision may not be right because we've changed the field. So the spatial aspect has changed and the climate continues to change. So I'm not going to dwell on this, but this is how you access all of the field crop soil compaction data that we built. So you can either go to this link, you can use this QR code, or just in Google, search for field crop news soil compaction, and it'll take you to all the material that we've created and the data from the events that we've put on. Another really good resource is from Jody DeJong Hughes at University of Minnesota, and there's a URL and a QR code to get to her Upper Midwest Soil Compaction Guide. If you really want to understand things, it's all in that document. It's a great resource. So, how does soil compaction happen? And I want to talk about the fact that there's a science component to it and there's a management component to it. And I want to run this little video, and hopefully the sound works. It's from an engineering soil mechanics guy from England, and he's talking about it from the standpoint of construction compaction, but think about it in the context of our agriculture, landscapes, and soil.
We've already seen that soil is a particulate material. And one of the really features of particulate materials is the void that are between the particles. Now, depending on where the soil is, it can be either filled with air or with water, or a mixture of both. Now, I've got 2 particles here, and we place this beaker full of water on that surface. And you'll see
the board is one of the particles.
Shearing resistance between the cup and the board is great enough to stop the cup from sliding downwards. Now let's look at an identical beaker. Here we are. We place it on that slope and we'll fill it with water. And we'll observe what happens.
Magic.
That this beaker has a hole in the bottom. Now the implications of that are that the water seeps through that hole and the head of water generates a pressure between the beaker, and how a build-up of water pressure between 2 particles can reduce the shearing resistance between those 2 particles.
Now this really answers why wet soils are so much more susceptible to compaction.
And we see it forms a cone.
It's building sandcastles.
The next one is with damp sand.
So why does it hold together?
Now here's another one, which is also from damp sand. But what happens when the tide comes in? So let's see what happens.
And look at how that collapses so quickly.
In each grain of sand, there is a little blob of water, and the surface tension pulls the two grains together and generates forces between them. And that increases their shear strength. And that is why this performs so well. So in summary, we have seen that water pressure in the voids of a soil reduces its shear strength, whereas in a damp soil, the surface tension in the water between the grains increases the forces between them and increases the shear strength.
So what he's saying is that we need some water to hold everything together, but when we have too much water, it completely annihilates the strength in those soil particles, allows all that movement to happen, and that's how we lose pore space and compaction results. So think about an optimum soil, and that soil is about 50% dry matter, so soil particles, organic matter, humus, dead bodies of animals that haven't turned into soil yet, this type of thing. And the other 50% sort of is a dynamic relationship between air and water spaces or pores within that landscape. And this is where soil compaction happens. We don't change the volume of the solid material, we change the volume of the pore spaces between those molecules. And so here is sort of an optimized soil, and here's a soil that's been compacted. You notice that we lose air spaces. There's less place for gas exchange to happen, which is critical to plant production. And it makes it harder for water to find its way through there. So what causes soil compaction? The other aspect of it is that I think is extremely important is it's a management decision. It's part of the whole risk management suite in farming, and it's decisions that we have to make. We have a choice as to whether we cause soil compaction or not. Some people get pissed at me when I say it in that way, but when you understand it in that way, it then means that, okay, if it's a management decision, there's something I can do about it. And so the reason I say it's a management decision is because all of these management decisions that I've got listed on the screen here are things that we have decided to do on each of those fields out in our landscape. And in deciding that through these types of decisions, it predisposes or protects us from the occurrence of soil compaction. And there is my logic for why it's a management decision. And so we got to go back to the when, where, what, why, how, and try and understand what are the right decisions to make to alleviate or prevent that compaction from happening. So I'm again referring to this slide so that we remember it. And it's putting the management into action, which addresses firstly compaction avoidance, which is the thing we really want to do, and secondly how to mitigate compaction once it's happened, which is much more difficult. It's easy to do, but expensive and actually hard on the ground. So think about soil compaction from the standpoint of we can manage it most of the time. We have to make the right decisions to put ourselves on a path to protect ourselves. And sometimes we make the wrong decisions and it's not pretty, and we have to accept that. There's nobody in farming that probably has never compacted some part of their field in some years, some condition. But being that it's a management decision, this is a list of things, and it's not really in any order other than we do feel that tile drainage is the #1 management decision in terms of reducing the impact of compaction, because it helps you manage all these other things. And any one thing that you do is better than doing nothing. When you add a couple of things together, you get this additive effect of 1 + 1 = 2. But as you start to build more and more of these sort of BMPs into your overall farm management, you get a synergistic response where the value is in that the overall soil health is increasing and making it much more resilient to the infrequent damages that you could potentially be doing to that landscape. So let's talk about some of the things that have created the environment that's led to soil compaction. If we go back to the 1960s, we had the little Alice Chalmers Gleaner combines. They weighed next to nothing. And you can see that as the load has increased, as we've moved to bigger and bigger types of equipment, positively, the tire volume has kept pace with that. And so if we look at this arrow versus this arrow over time, they haven't changed that much. So that's positive, but unfortunately, it hasn't been reflected in the contact area on the ground. So you got a great big massive tire, but then you only still have this little patch that's on the ground. And that's impacting the transmission of weight down into the depths of the soil. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. And this is an important graph, and think about it like it's kind of upside down from our normal thinking. And so we have loss in the lower subsoil, we have loss in the mid subsoil, and we have loss in the plow layer. And the losses associated with the subsoil are losses that are associated with the overall mass of the implement that you're pulling across the field. And those are hard to get back. The next one is the compaction that happens as a function of axle weight. And the way to remedy this is to add more axles to a piece of equipment. So we spread that load out. And the third one is the yield loss that occurs in the topsoil area or in the plow layer in the seed zone. And it's primarily a function of the tire pressures that we choose. And the lower the tire pressure, the less likely we are to get that compaction. So we ask ourselves when we look at a chart like this, what's the worst case scenario? And this one is the most visible that we see because it affects plant growth. We see the ruts in the field and that type of thing. But the ones that but they're also fixable. And notice that over the course of 5 years, they correct themselves quite a bit. Whereas the mid subsoil area takes longer to correct itself. And at the deep zone, it's almost impossible to get that back, even with deep ripping. This is a 2 to 4% loss in yield that you may never be able to recover. And then let's look at this chart from the context of when do we spread our manure relative to when soils are more susceptible to compaction. So here we're looking at the axle weight on the x-axis, and we're looking at the percent yield loss on the y-axis. And note that they looked at it over the course of dry soil conditions, normal soil conditions, and wet soil conditions. And notice that when you have your axle weight down lower, that the amount of difference in dispersion of those lines is not as great as when you increase the axle weight. And notice that these red arrows are bigger than the yellow cautionary arrows because there's more compaction happening as that added weight occurs and then under the type of soil condition moisture-wise. And so that's why some of the old equipment that's had terrible configurations in terms of old bias tires at really high PSI and stuff really don't show up as being a compacting problem compared to even relatively good configurations in large, heavy equipment. The other thing about compaction, and especially in the context of manure application, is the repeated compaction in the same place. So here's a study by the guys in Denmark, Sweden area, and they looked at the impact of compaction if that compaction was repeated in the same place at the same time each year. And notice that compaction was cumulative. It kept getting worse because it never had an opportunity for recovery because we recompacted it again. Now, this is an interesting little blip right here in that how come that's showing up a little bit and yet it falls back again? And I would suggest to you that back to the little video from the British scientists, This is where the soil was really wet in a given year and it hid the compaction. Same reason why we don't go looking for compaction when the soils are really wet, because we can push that tile probe down really easily because the presence of that excess water in the soil profile lubricates the soils and lets that compaction act as if it's not there. But then notice the next year it's drier and again the compaction shows itself. So we're talking about it in terms of manure specifically in this conversation. Here's a map from a field in the States. And again, look at the odd shape of the field, but look at how much of that field was trafficked in the application of the manure. And the only reason it's not here is because that's too much of a slope for them to apply manure on. But we're going to look at this a little bit more. So this chart here, or this graphic, is showing the path being driven by the planter, the sprayer, tillage, and the combine. And so you see that. So all the green is the sort of planting and prep passes, and the yellow is the combine. And that doesn't seem that complex. But now add in things like the sprayer and the grain cart and all these other things, and you get this amount of traffic just increases exponentially across the field. And it's just, we'll get to it in a study here that I'm going to show you. An interesting concept is there's a difference between an engineering concept of when compaction happens and an agricultural aspect. And so the blue, red, and green are the sort of engineering aspect. They say that up to 80% of the compaction effect will happen in the first pass, and the passes after that won't be as bad. The problem is, in an agricultural context, this line indicates when yields may begin to be impacted. This line indicates when yields definitely are impacted. And notice, depending on whether it was dry, optimal moisture, or wet, that can happen in the first compactive event, so the manure spreading under wet conditions. And so then the other stuff doesn't really affect the crop because it's already hurt the crop. So we're trying to be down here where we stay underneath the red line especially. So think about a big manure tanker, and you're going out there and you start at the edge of the field and you start applying manure. We lose manure out of these kind of equipment in sort of a linear fashion. And if that's true, then it should be easy to do the math to determine when sort of the weight got to the point that it's a safe value in terms of not impacting the soil. But the problem is, it's back to this map I showed you at the beginning, the spatial aspect. And think about this transit across the field, and think about the blue areas being more susceptible to compaction because they're wetter, and the brown areas being less, and the green areas being medium. And so I start applying with a full load, and as I go by, I'm lowering the amount of material in that manure tanker. But notice that at this point here, I'm in blue. Even though I've let off a bunch of weight, I still could be over the tolerance level of that wetter soil. And even down here, if it's very wet and I still got a third of a tanker left, maybe I can still be causing compaction. So it's this aspect of the spatial that complexes our understanding of how much yield impact we potentially get. So think about how we harvest grains, right? Take this great big header in to combine soybeans and cereals. We take this big corn header in to do corn, and we take all of that into the combine at the same time. And so how do we determine the compaction, which really only happened as a function of the wheel passes across the landscape? And so when we talk about yield loss due to compaction, it's not the whole field, it's places within the field that get diluted into the yield across the plot as a whole. So this is a study that Scott Shear and John Fulton did at Ohio State, and they looked at 4 different implements: a grain cart, 36-row planter, 16-row combine, and a manure applicator. look at the percentage of that area that was trafficked by the general use of each of those implements. And look at the manure applicator was up to 44% or above 44%. And then what they did is they looked at it in the context of a no-till situation with a 200 bushel per acre yield potential of that field. And then they did it under normal moisture conditions and wet conditions. And I don't know how they created that. And it is a study, so you got to bear that in mind. But this is the interesting part, is that under normal conditions, the goal was 200. Under normal conditions, we're at 175 with the grain cart. We're at 189 with the manure applicator. Whereas in the wet areas, we're down to 148 compared to 200, and compared to 175. We're down to 168 in this situation, which is not as bad. But look at the difference in these yields because of the difference between this and this. So we're trafficking all that area, leading to much more potential for overall yield impact under those wet conditions. But, you know, manure application, 200 bushels, we're losing 5 bushels under normal conditions. Don't like it, but it's still a lot easier to stomach than 15 or 16 bushels per acre. So there are some simple solutions to compaction, but nobody's going to put them into force these days because, one, we don't have the manpower, and two, where would you find this many little tractors with 1 furrow plows? But the aspect of the decisions that we make have to be practical. And so we need to think about mass. So here's Brent's big 2596, 2,500 bushel grain cart. When you add in the crop weight and the cart weight, you come up with 94.4 tons that you're going to be pulling across that field. I should be using a manure spreader, but I didn't have as good a data as this. So my question to you is, just because I can doesn't mean I should. So, you know, in a bad fall, do we need to fill that big cart every time and create the compaction threat that by putting half load or 3/4 of load in, we'd far reduce the potential for the compaction to happen? So the answer is quite simple. In practice, it's not so much. Again, I'm going back to this: lower the weight, lower the water, and lower the air. And so we need to reduce axle weight and total load. It's relatively easy to reduce axle weight by adding more axles. Much of our equipment is not designed to be able to do that, and we need to put pressure on the manufacturers to give us products that allow us to have more axles involved. Reducing the total load is more problematic because even with more axles, reducing the axle load, I still get this problem of that total mass. And I'll show you some graphs of why that's a problem. And so maybe we need to think about things like smaller grain buggies and mother bins at the side of the field. Maybe we need to think about frac tanks on the roadside or in the ditch, and a smaller manure tanker filling from that frac tank. It's really important to avoid wet soils. And the problem is, when is it too wet? That's a function of the spatial aspects of the change in the soil texture across the field and how much moisture we've got and how well our soils drain. And we need to get the PSI down as low as we can. And I'm going to show you the impact of that. Okay. So it requires a change of thinking, and that's why I went back to the where, when, why, how, what, and what. And that needs to come into our thinking if we want to sort of change the trajectory that we're currently taking. Okay. Lower the air. I'm going to show some examples of central tire inflation system. They really need to be a serious consideration for anybody that's tanking manure across the road. If everything's done close to home on the farm and you can putt down the road at 6 to 8 miles an hour instead of 25, well, then you can get away without it. But this back and forth into the field is really problematic based on the fact that you have to have the tires pumped up to carry that load at speed on the road. And that is not the pressure you want in the field. But without CTIS, who's going to up and down pressure, a noon quad tanker with 12 900 tires on it? Nobody. So lots of people don't like these goals, and they're just targets to go for. But from the work that we've done and the work that's been done in Europe, we suggest that we try and get tires at no more than 25 or 7,500 pounds on each tire, and that the tire pressures max out at 20 psi when they're in the field. But less is always better, right? Because 10 is 50% less than 20, and that's great. We've got lots of guys running 6 to 9 psi out in the field. We've got lots of tankers running at 10 psi with CTIS and 40 psi on the road. But the question is how to achieve it. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. So this is just a graph of how our data is laid out. I'm just going to talk you through the graph so that when we look at the actual data, it makes sense to you. So at the top, you'll see information on the piece of equipment and the type of tires that are on it. And we often now are testing, because most of this work is done in July and August. That's when the soils are mostly the driest they'll ever be in the season. And so we don't see much response to heavy equipment at that time. So we wet up some pits to try and make it synergistic or analogous to spring or fall. It's not perfect, but it sure gives you an indication. So we're looking at the soil pressure. We stick these probes in the ground that I'll show you, and they've got water in them on a rubber nipple. And when we drive across that, we see a response show up on a big screen and in the computer. And that's what these responses are right here. So we always keep the scale the same so that a change in scale doesn't change how you look at the data. This is time. So in this case, this would be the tractor front tire, the tractor back tire, and the implement tandem axles. So this is detecting the pressure as the implement drives across the sensors that are buried in the ground. And we have a 6-inch probe, a 12-inch probe, and a 20-inch probe. These two lines are theoretical lines based on the work in Europe, and they're suggesting at 6 inches, we want to be under 14.7 psi detected by that transmission of stress into the soil. And for the 12 and 20-inch thresholds, we want to be below 7.5 because there's less organic matter, there's less other things that are resilient and that will bounce back from stress like we have in the top 6 inches. And it's also easier to manage to recover from compaction shallowly than deeper. Okay, so this is one of our systems. This is what we call the Noon Rubber Railroad. It's 2 tankers with 3 axles with 900 tires on it, and it has a central tire inflation system. And so this is the tires, and on the road, those tires have to be at 40 psi based on the weight, and they can be at 10 psi in the field. And so under the high pressure, the green is looking at the 6-inch point, the black is the 12-inch, and the red is the 20-inch. And note that the black line here is the line that we would like the black line and the red line to be under to be safest. And we'd like the green graph charts to be under the green horizontal line. So we're seeing a lot of stress there at 40 psi on our soils. We lower that down to 10 psi, and immediately you see this big change in the impact that we're having on the soil. But it's a little bit of a card shuffle game, because yes, in the 6-inch and the 12-inch, we're seeing significant declines in the stress being detected in the soil because of that implement going across. And at 20 inches, it's above threshold here. It's just below threshold here, but it's still there. So this is back to the conversation about mass and trying to understand the fact that despite what you do with tires and axles and this type of thing, mass is still being translocated down into the soil, and we have to be conscious of that. Okay, so I'm going back to this thing. Again, thinking about the concept of mass, 94.4 tons on that, not including the articulated tractor pulling it. Okay, again, just because I can doesn't mean I necessarily should. Okay, this is a trestle bridge over on the other side of Toronto, and it has a weight limit on it. And this is not actually the sign, because I didn't have a picture of the sign, but it indicates the same thing. So maximum of 16 tons. We've got 94 tons. Anybody got the confidence to drive that full buggy over that trestle bridge? I would hope you'd say no. Okay. So again, the answer is quite simple, but in practice, not so much, because there's money involved, there's time involved, there's the logistics of the whole operation involved, and we need to think about that. And again, back to this concept of lower the weight, lower the water, lower the air, and we're trying to reduce axle weight, we're trying to avoid wet soils, and we're trying to get that PSI low. But this is because I had to change computers. I have a fourth one now for manure application because of the weight that we're carrying. And the fourth one in this context would be lower the amount of traffic, right? Think about a field that you get halfway down the field when you empty out the manure tanker. Now you got to go back, pick up another load, and come back to that starting point. So now you're doing double duty over the same place to get back to the starting point for the next pass. That's problematic. Let's talk about how to manage some of that. And so here's how we put the sensors in the ground. And they go in. We've done this for like 10 or 12 events now, and we've been really pleased with the fact that we're within an inch of those 6, 12, and 20-inch targets on every single one of our installations. Okay, again, this inflation system, and I just want to emphasize this graph again. Okay, so let's look at some other data. This is CTIS as well, but it's also change in tires. So we're comparing the difference between the 30.5, as you can see here, it has to be at 40 and 15 PSI based on the manufacturer's recommendations for on the road and in the field. And this is an 18.4 radial, but it's much thinner. Notice that it's rounded versus this tire, which is flat. And notice that it has to be at 50 and 20 road to field. And so same load, and it's just one side of the track of the tanker is equipped with these two types of tires. What does that result in? So here's the 18.4 tire versus the 30.5 tire at the road PSI. And so you'll notice that all of them are relatively high, but this is a 5,000 gallon tanker, and we're not transferring the weight into the soil at the same we did with the 14,000 gallon tanker of the rubber railroad. And so we don't see as much difference as maybe what we thought we might see. But when we go to the low PSI, again, with both tires, look at how much the change in tire pressure allowed us to reduce the transmission of stress into the field, right? And so that's the important value of sort of the consideration of, is CTIS worth exploring financially and practically? This is from the North American Manure Expo in 2021. So this was a big tanker. It had 35.5 52s, and we ran it over the sensors at 32 PSI. And look at the deflection of the tires in this little video clip. And now here's the thing reduced to 14 PSI. Again, look at the deflection of the tires. So here is that tire at 32 PSI in the dry soil versus the wet soil. Notice that it didn't make as much difference as what we might have thought, but it's still there, and it's something to be considered. This is a big tire. We dropped it from 30, or this case, it's 32 PSI in both the dry and wet soils. And so that's the response we saw. when we dropped the tire pressure to 14 psi, again, even in the wetter soil, it helped, got us under thresholds, not perfect, but better than in the drier soil. But notice, and this is something we still can't understand, and that's the complexity of agriculture research. Why is this blue line under the wetter soil not higher than on the dry soil? Still trying to understand that. Here's another little unit. And again, duals, 710, 46, 22.5. That's a pretty good size tire. And that's at 46 PSI. Now look at the deflection at the lower PSI. I'll switch here in a second. Okay. But that's a big manure spreader. What does the data look like for that? So here's under at 46 PSI, which is what's required of the road, dry soil and wet soil. And under wet soil, notice, and again, there's a bit of a change in the resolution here, so I apologize, but look at the spikes that are happening in the wet soil at that high PSI. And then we go down to the 26 PSI, and obviously wet soil, dry soil, we still see these differences. We still have this confounding thing is, why is this 12-inch less in the wet soil than in dry? Is it because it's taking more stress at the 6-inch level? That's part of it. We've seen that when we have a compactive layer at the top, and it could be part and parcel of it. But again, we're seeing responses to the dry versus wet and the change in soil tire pressure. So this is a similar type rig, triaxle 710 VF tires now, and 26.5. So they're a bigger tire. It's a bigger spreader. Again, 46 PSI. So very little, if any, deflection in the tire sidewall. And then 25 PSI. Notice 3 axles, bigger tires, more weight, but spread out more evenly. We're not seeing the deflection, even though we've lowered the PSI. Okay, so 46 PSI for on the road. Drier soil, wetter soil. Notice that even the tractor is showing up more in the wetter soil than in the drier soil. Okay? But again, this is an important part to make vis-a-vis where the compaction is happening. We're seeing ruts. We're seeing stress in that 6-inch. Look at down at 20 inches. We're seeing not much difference in the amount of stress. Now it's below tolerance, but in different configurations, it might not be. And so this has got to be a serious consideration. We really don't want to drive stress down that deep. Now we're down at 25 PSI. Notice that we've really reduced the mass here. We're not getting near the response at any of the pressures in that wetter soil. So again, proving that lower pressure is better and drier soils are better. What do we do with equipment like this, which still lots of people have? So in this case, we looked at a 16.1 bias ply, and then we looked at a newer 560 22.5. And interestingly enough, we didn't see as much response as what I would have anticipated at any of the levels, because of it is a much lighter unit than those big box spreaders or the liquid tankers. And so when you've got less weight, you've got less stress going in, you can run on wetter conditions. You're not going to get as much response to things like CTIS systems and such, but it's still a consideration. So I go back to this chart again. Think about this as the small spreader. Think about this as the big spreader. We're not getting the contact area, and that's what's contributing to compaction from this big equipment. So we had some fun when we were at the North American Manure Expo demos in 21, and we were playing with that, and we wanted to show the difference in footprint. So what we did was we took the round tire versus the flat tire, and we looked at the 2 PSIs for in the field and on the road in each situation, and look at the difference visually of the footprint that's associated with those conditions of the implement. And it's again going back to this aspect of footprint. But keep in mind that yes, we want a bigger footprint, but we also want to not push heavy stress down deep into that soil profile. And again, back to this chart, we're trying to avoid this that we won't get back. And then second, we're trying to avoid this. And, we don't like those ruts, but they're maybe not as problematic as stuff that's happening at this level. Okay, so, I got it in here. So again, I keep coming back to this chart. How do we find ways to make decisions in the configuration and the timing of operations to get to these criteria? So this is manure specific. Some of you won't like this, and I apologize, but it is what it is, and you can use it as you see fit. So fill the tanker or the manure spreader so that it runs out at the field length. So you don't have to come back into the middle of the field with a full load to start again. Avoid a full tanker traveling in the field when it's not applying manure and getting lighter. If the field's long and you can't make it with the tank, then split the field into 2 or 3 segments. So, if you got a mile-long field, you maybe can't make it the whole way. Split it so that you've always got the traffic happening in the same place. So you're not spreading that compaction across the landscape. Try to have at least 2 entry points in a field, and I'll show you an example of this. And it's critically important, but most people don't think about it or can't make it work. And then also build a crop plan that optimizes the time and soil condition to minimize compaction from traffic. So have cereals in the rotation so that you can be applying manure in the summer months when the conditions are best able to take that weight. And finally, invest in the best tires and CTAS combinations that you can afford that make sense for your operation. We've got fields that are getting anywhere from 40 to 55% of the field area is being traveled by equipment. Not necessarily full at that time, but any pass with equipment, cumulative by repeated passes, is problematic. So here's some just quick examples to finish up. Thanks, Chris, for this slide. Great big long field. He's not even getting out to the end of the field. He's just going out, turning around, coming back. If productivity and reduction of compaction is part of your goals, this is not the way to go about it. Some people have to do it because of practical nature, but I would suggest with some thought, there's ways to address this to try and reduce that. This is my friend, Eric Kaiser up in Napanee. Many people here in Ontario know him. They are lucky to have 1,300 acres in one block. And you see all these roadways they have in the field, and all of this is surrounded by grass waterways that they can run on. We're going to look at these 2 fields specifically. And so here's where the manure lagoon is. Tractor comes down, comes into the field, can come in several places, goes down, and then comes back up. And I'll show you that in a second. These fields, he's got roads on both ends of them. So he can come in right at the right place, start going and exit, and he's just reduced the amount of tramping whatsoever. What has always amazed me about my no-tiller guys is that they, more than anybody, are conscious of soil compaction. So here's the rig coming back empty, heading for the lagoon, and notice that even though it's empty, where is it traveling? On the grassway, not in the field. So that's what I have for you. And again, there's lots of factors there. I probably went too fast. Thankfully, it's recorded, and you can go back and see some of the stuff if you're interested. But if you have any questions, fire away.
I'll just jump into a couple quick questions in the chat right off the bat. First of all, Deb, interesting enough, really liked your soil type maps and is just wondering where they are from.
That is the Linders Field at Woodrow Farms, just east of, right east of the farm on the Highway 7 at Guelph.
Yeah, Guelph, Ontario.
13 or 14 different soil types.
Amazing, and not unusual either.
Not unusual. We tend to put them together because we don't want to manage 14, but that's how many are there.
And that's something that stood out to me as you went through all this. It's just like nobody's saying there isn't complexity with this. This is very complex, just on the soil type alone, let alone the equipment, the conditions at the particular time. It is complex. And nobody's saying that the goal is zero compaction, because that's just not realistic.
True.
But it's managing it. How do we reduce it? And at least to give some thought to that. I remember the one diagram you've shown in the past of, and you had some in here as well, but just showing from satellite imagery, you could see where the equipment had gone in turning around and everything else. And you think nothing of it until you see it all at once. And it blows your mind. Yeah, the 40 to 55% of a field being tracked. That's huge. The work that you showed, Scott Shearer's, it had the yield reduction in the different, wetter, drier, and so on. The question that Mark had was the yield reduction just measured in the tracked areas, or was it just taken as an overall field yield? Do you know the answer to that? Chris thinks that it was the tracked area, but not 100%.
So this is in the tracked area, and this is how it contributed to the overall yield. So field average versus tracked under normal conditions, under wet conditions. So the compaction happens in the track. Its impact can be beyond the rows that it actually affects, but it's not the whole width of the header type of thing. And the bigger the headers, it gets diluted, right? The bigger the equipment, the more space between them. But notice 175 resulted in 196. Not that big a deal. The big one is
assuming
168 resulted in 186 because of this number versus this number.
Got it. Yep. So again, 200 was the average yield goal, but then the reduction coming because of the tracked areas had resulted in the reduced field average.
So you have to be a little bit careful when you're looking at some of the marketing and some of the research that's being done to determine whether the percentage of yield loss they're talking about is field average or is the tracked. And sometimes they don't do a good job of telling you that.
Okay. So you mentioned a few times, Ian, about this idea of just the overall mass of just literally the mass and the weight of an implement going through the field, how that is explaining compaction, but there's also the lowering PSI via tires and so on. And so David is wondering if you can just elaborate a little bit more about that, the mass and why lowering PSI via tires does not answer the question.
So think about taking a big manure tanker over that trestle bridge picture that I showed you, okay? In the field, I can put more axles on and I can lower the PSI to have a bigger footprint of contact area and to reduce the stress on a per square inch basis. But when I get up on top of that trestle bridge, regardless of how many axles and what tire pressure I'm at, the bridge is supporting the entire weight. And it's that entire weight that you cannot deflect from the system of being transferred deep into the soil. We can't manipulate that. The only way to manipulate that is to lower the overall weight. So that deep compaction is a function of that overall weight. Then the lighter that is, and then still positive to have more tires and axles and lower pressure, but think about that trestle bridge. It's going to collapse. And it's the same thing in the soil. Well, not the same thing, but that's the analogy.
Not a message everybody wants to hear.
No.
As equipment's getting bigger, but we have to realize that that's just a science reality, and there's no way around it. How about tracks? You didn't really touch on tracks very much. Any comments on tracks and how they might affect the readings?
So a friend of mine in the industry said to me a few years ago, tires are becoming more like tracks and tracks are becoming more like tires. So think about Klaas's forage harvester with track drive, and at the end of the field, to not rip up the alfalfa, the front bogey lifts up to make a smaller footprint for that thing to turn around the corner, so making itself more like a tire. What do? We put big tires on and put central tire inflation system. What we're trying to do is deflect that sidewall and make that tire longer, and so more like a track in terms of the surface area. So it comes down to price and maintenance and how far are you roading? Have you ever seen a manure tanker on tracks? I have not. And that's interesting relative to grain buggies and stuff. But think about where grain buggies ride. If you look at your invoice or your requirements of a grain buggy, you're not supposed to ride that grain buggy on the road full, whether it's tired or tracked. But that's why you're seeing more tracks on grain buggies and not on manure tankers.
Right on.
So and the other thing is that with a tire and an inflation system, I can change the configuration. With a track, it is what it is, and it always has to be the maximum weight. So you don't have any choice. Once you put the track on, it's there at the highest weight that you need all the time.
Yeah. Mark made the comment just in terms of, again, back to the Scott Shearer there, the yield reduction, soil type being a factor in that. Just wondering how much worse it would have been on higher clay soils. He didn't know what the soil test was of the actual fields.
I would assume, based on where they do their research down there, that it's a loam.
Yeah, probably. So moving to high clay soils.
Worse.
Obviously would be worse. Yeah.
Yeah. But sand's still compact, right? Just because you have sands doesn't mean you don't have to think about this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. How much does our winter help us in terms of breaking things up? We get some freeze, thaw. Is that a major help or not so much?
I'll tell you a story real quick. Steve Sickle, a farmer south of here, has a slug problem. And so what he did is he went out in January with 5 inches of snow because there was no frost going into the ground. He rolled all the snow down so that he could drive frost into the landscape. We have not been getting the winters, either temperature wise or snowpack wise, that have allowed us to get that frost down deep. Many years now, we've been going without frost any deeper than 4 to 6 inches. So we're not getting the freeze thaw action that you need for that to work. Be great if it worked, but it's not happening, it seems.
Yeah, we had quite a snowpack this year, so there are a lot of areas where they're not finding much frost in the ground at all because of that. So anyhow, we're at the end of our time here, Ian. Listen, thank you very much. Very interesting discussion on compaction. So we thank you for your time. Thank you for the work you're doing, and look forward to hearing next steps. Folks, reminder, next week is our last week. Application strategies to maximize nitrogen and reduce greenhouse gas losses in the field. That's going to be a good session to wrap it up with. So we look forward to you joining us back here, same time, same place. Have a great week. Cheers.